So we have to have other ways of determining whether the sows are under chronic stress or not. So you mentioned productivity, and that is a big one. So chronically stressed sows will typically have reduced productivity levels. So we will see maybe fewer born alive or more born dead piglets, more abortions as well. And that's because stress, as it sort of affects the body, it does so by driving the immune response down. So if the immune response is down, the body's resources are obviously redirected to things other than performance, for example. So the sow is just trying to maintain the body condition and trying to fight disease that might also come as a result of the immune system being driven down by the stress. So in the cases where animals are chronically stressed, we will see productivity going down.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Swine at Canada podcast. I am Dan Columbus, and I will be your host for today's episode. And with me today, I have Dr. Martyna Lagoda, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. So thank you for joining us today, Martyna.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, just because people may not be as aware of you because you are fairly new to Canada too. So I will just ask you to give maybe a brief introduction to yourself and your history and kind of your journey so far.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Martyna Lagoda. I came from Ireland, as you mentioned. I'm only here in Canada 4 months, so I'm fairly new to the country and the industry here. But in terms of my journey, in terms of training, I trained as a zoologist. So my bachelor's degree was in science, where I specialized in zoology. And then I moved on to study behavior and welfare at master's level. And my journey with pigs really began with my PhD project, because that's when I really started to study the species. And having started that, I know I can say for sure I will never go back from pigs. I'm in pigs for life. But in terms of the work that I'm covering in swine, it's welfare related. So welfare and behavior, and the topics that I've covered so far in my short career up to date, mainly focused on sow welfare and piglet welfare. So my PhD topic covered a lot of issues surrounding chronic stress in sows and how that affects both the sow and the piglet. So yeah, I think that kind of covers it up to date.
I think it's interesting. It's a common thing that people seem to get. They get into swine and then they love it and they never leave. I don't know what it is about pigs. You just have to get past the smell, apparently, and then
yes,
you love it and you never go back. So so I guess you've already kind of talked about it a little bit, but so today we're going to focus on the stuff that you kind of did before arriving in Canada, and you did mention with sows. And so I know you've done work, focusing on the sow biology and their movements and how that kind of affects their behavior and locomotion. So, I mean, we'll get right into that, and, kind of like, why is that important? And, what have you been doing and finding in that area?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So I think my PhD project, it's all in a European context. And in Europe, we've had group housing as a rule sort of for the industry since 2013. So all of my work is sort of in that context. And in saying that, I mean that having sows in groups is obviously good for their welfare, because they get extra exercise, they can perform more of their natural behavioral repertoire, but it also has some negative sides to it. So there's a lot of aggression that goes on obviously in groups, and we know a lot about mixing aggression and how that causes acute short-term stress in those sows. But we don't really know much about is the chronic stress. So there is a lot of factors in the environment that the sows are exposed to that can cause chronic stress. And this is what I've been focusing on in my PhD. So trying to investigate all of the different possible risk factors for chronic stress in the sows, and then also looking at how those factors cause the chronic stress, how to measure the chronic stress, and the effects that it has on both the sow herself in terms of her welfare and productivity, because of course we want to avoid the chronic stress in those animals because we want them to have good welfare, but we also want them to perform well for the producers as the end goal. And then following on from that, we also wanted to know a little bit more about how that chronic stress experienced by the sow can possibly transfer onto the offspring as they develop in utero, and that's known as prenatal stress. So it's a well-covered area in other species, but in pigs it is still a little bit under research. So we really wanted to make that connection between the sow chronic stress and the piglet, because I think if we can address the chronic stress at sow level and prevent that transferring onto the offspring and sort of protect the offspring from it, then that's always going to be a benefit, because we want those piglets to be productive as well. At the end of the day, they are the market, the production animals, so we want them to do well. So the topic that I've covered sort of focused around that. And you mentioned the locomotion, looking at that in the sows, and that comes into play because locomotion relates to lameness, and lameness obviously is a very painful disorder for the sows, for the pigs overall. So it is a potential chronic stress risk factor, and that's why we looked at it as part of my studies as well.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about like what factors you specifically looked at. I guess you mentioned locomotion was one of them. Like, so what are some of the other things that you've kind of looked at that seem to have an impact on the chronic stress?
Yeah, so as the sort of start off to my PhD, I did a literature review to sort of get a idea for what knowledge do we have on this topic of chronic stress. So I looked at the potential risk factors, just looking at papers, seeing if whatever they study does that have any potential result in terms of cortisol levels. And cortisol, I mentioned cortisol because cortisol is really the main way of measuring stress. So, and on the chronic scale, we would typically measure chronic stress using cortisol in hair. So I can discuss that at a later point as well, if we come to it. But so some of the factors that I came across that do potentially cause chronic stress in sows include lameness, as I already said, but also, so these factors would relate to both the physical and the social aspects of the sow's environment. So some of the physical ones would be the group size and group type that the sows are in. So we could have stable or dynamic groups, and that causes different interactions between the sows, obviously. So also influences their behavior in terms of things like aggression. So it does drive the stress levels in different ways. The design of the pen would be another physical aspect of the environment that could cause chronic stress. So, for example, having pens that have hiding areas or even free access feeding stalls in systems that use that kind of system, these basically create areas for the sows to escape into and avoid the aggressors in their environment. So having a pen with those hidden either barriers or little sort of areas that the sows can escape into usually is good for reducing chronic stress because it just allows the sows to escape those stressful situations. Floor is another factor in the physical environment as well that affects chronic stress, and that plays into lameness, because we know that having sows on fully slatted concrete floors is not great for their lameness status. It's very uncomfortable to be on those floors. It leads to a lot of injuries, especially when they fight at mixing. Their claws can get injured, and that can then develop into more serious lameness. So that also drives up the chronic stress levels, because that pain that is experienced as part of lameness, it's not just, it doesn't go away after any period of time. It usually stays on and affects the sow on a longer scale. So I think in terms of the physical factors, that sort of enrichment is another one. So provision of enrichment, of course, helps with driving down the chronic stress levels, because it allows the sows to perform their natural behaviors that they're really motivated for. So I think that covers the physical factors. And then in terms of the social factors, I sort of touched on that already. Aggression and the structure of the group in terms of the status of the animals. So the proportion of dominant to subordinate animals in the group obviously has an effect. If we have many bullies in the pen, that sort of drive the stress levels up in the less dominant animals, that is a factor that contributes. Also the individual factors, individual sow factors rather, that can contribute to stress levels. So for example, having a group of sows that's not balanced for parity can be a problem, because having a lot of older sows can mean that there is more dominant animals, and that obviously affects the behavior in the group and drives the stress levels up as well. And then another factor that's sort of more known in other aspects, so we look at it when we look at the productivity of sows, is heat stress as well. So that also can contribute a lot to chronic stress. And I think now with the change in climate and temperatures going up in countries, so for example, I'm from Ireland. Summers in Ireland are not particularly hot, but for the past few years, the temperatures have definitely been out of the normal range. And I mean, farms in countries like Ireland are not really, I suppose, made for hot weather. So, it's difficult for those sows. It's those sort of exceptional conditions can really have an impact. And we know that, pigs are very sensitive to heat stress. So that is a big factor as well.
Yeah, it's probably a very similar situation to Canada. And it's interesting to be talking about heat stress when we're moving into winter and people are starting to bundle up. But, we do have the same thing. Our barns are made more for protecting against the cold than probably against the heat. But yeah, a lot of things to consider. It's clearly not an easy area or thing to kind of optimize. You mentioned that you measure cortisol as like your main kind of indicator of the chronic stress, but I'm wondering, on the other side of it, what would be some of the outcomes that would happen as a result of these chronic stress, like from a productivity standpoint or something along those lines?
Yeah, so that's a good point, because cortisol is really the sort of gold standard when measuring stress, but there are other methods of doing it. So just going back to cortisol, it's not always possible to control for every single factor that might affect cortisol levels. So, for example, when we do studies in a commercial setting, it's that would not be possible to control for everything. So we have to have other ways of determining whether the sows are under chronic stress or not. So you mentioned productivity, and that is a big one. So chronically stressed sows will typically have reduced productivity levels. So we will see maybe fewer born alive or more born dead piglets, more abortions as well. And that's because stress, as it sort of affects the body, it does so by driving the immune response down. So if the immune response is down, the body's resources are obviously redirected to things other than performance, for example. So the sow is just trying to maintain the body condition and trying to fight disease that might also come as a result of the immune system being driven down by the stress. So in the cases where animals are chronically stressed, we will see productivity going down. And also, as I already mentioned, disease as well. Susceptibility to disease will be increased as well with chronically stressed animals. So that's sort of immunity and the health side of things, but we can also determine whether animals are under chronic stress. And that's not just in pigs, this is really applicable to other species as well.
Mm-hmm.
So another way would be to look at their behavior. So in pigs, from my own studies even, we've shown that chronically stressed sows would have higher levels of stereotypies. So stereotypies are those behaviors that are sort of functionless, unvarying, repetitive behaviors, and the animals would typically perform them when they are frustrated. They're not able to perform their natural behaviors that they're highly motivated for, and stereotypies are their way of coping with that stressful environment around them. So chronically stressed sows show significantly higher levels of stereotypies than animals that are not stressed. So I think these are good indicators to look out for when trying to. We don't just have to measure the cortisol to know that an animal might be under stress.
Yeah. So because obviously, like you said, cortisol is one of the big ones that's usually used, and you mentioned measuring it in hair, and I know that this is a big thing that's coming out of the group that you're now in, and trying to optimize this. So
Yes.
maybe we'll take the opportunity now, because we're talking about it,
Mm-hmm.
to discuss that aspect of it, and what it, why we would be looking at it in hair, and why that's important.
So being in this group now, a lot of work here is being done on hair cortisol, and I really like that because I can learn a lot and compare the methods that I've used in my PhD to what's being done here, and that's really nice because as I've mentioned with hair cortisol especially, there's not a lot of research done on it in pigs. It's constantly growing now, which is good. But we still don't know a lot about it. So, for example, we don't really know how the cortisol is incorporated into the hair. So there's that issue of trying to decide whether we should pluck the hair or shave it, to not include the hair follicle, because we don't know if there's cortisol actually being produced in the hair follicle itself, or does it all just come from the bloodstream. So there is lots unknowns when it comes to hair cortisol. And there's also a lot of factors that affect the level of cortisol, like I already mentioned. And performance studies on commercial farms, it's not always possible to control for all of that. So when I say there is lots of things that affect it, I mean things like hair color, the sex of the animal, stage of pregnancy, or even the level of contamination on the animal's body. So, for example, having the animal covered in feces and urine, which is obviously the case on farm conditions, that can really affect the cortisol levels, because the cortisol in the feces and urine can then be incorporated into the hair. So then we don't know how much of the cortisol came from the contamination or from the actual bloodstream of the animal to represent the animal's stress response. So hair cortisol is really a tricky one. And the method that I used, I was able to use it both on a commercial farm and in a research farm scenario. And this is, again, when those factors that affect the levels and can sort of bias our results come in, because on the commercial farm, I wasn't able to control for a lot of these factors. And in my studies performed at that level, I had no significant results when it comes to hair cortisol. But then when they were performed in a research scenario, I had nice, significant results. So it just goes to show how tricky some measures can be. And that's why I like being here as well, because I can learn what perhaps they're doing differently to improve the method. But another thing about hair cortisol is that or really about the stress response of an animal, it's very individual. So every animal responds to stress differently. And when an animal is chronically stressed, the stress axis of the animal can respond in different ways depending on that individual. So some animals, when chronically stressed, they might actually have a blunted stress response. So then we don't see levels as high as we would expect for a stressed animal. And then in other individuals, we might see, for example, a heightened response to stress. So a chronically stressed animals, funnily enough, might actually be hyper reactive to acute short-term stress. So it's a very individualistic response, and that's why it's so difficult to generalize it and measure it at group level. And I think with most studies to date, the focus has been on group level and not really on individual level. And I think to accurately know more about how individuals respond to stress, we really should be moving towards focusing on those individual animals, because they're all individuals. They all react differently. They just have their own individual personalities that affects it.
I think it makes sense, when we're starting to look, it's the same thing in nutrition where we look at the group response to what we're feeding instead of the individual. And now with looking at precision feeding, we're finding out how different, each individual requirement is and how they respond and how efficient they are. Right. So it's kind of very similar where it's like, we look at the individual animal, it complicates things really, really badly, to think of like, how are you actually looking at it? But
that's right.
So I guess then getting back and maybe coming to one of the other topics that you looked at, because when you're talking about outcomes, you focused a lot on the sow, right? But you mentioned that you've also looked at that prenatal stress and how it affects the offspring. So maybe we'll discuss that for a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice part of my work, because that's the part that really links into the production side of things, because this is where we try to influence the offspring, the market animals, to make them more productive and ensure that they have better welfare. So, as I said, prenatal stress is that phenomenon where if the mother, while she is pregnant, while she experiences chronic stress, that stress will be transferred onto the offspring as they develop in utero. So usually this is hormonally mediated. So the cortisol levels in the mother will transfer across the placenta to the offspring as they develop. And those cortisol levels then ending up in the offspring, they actually alter the development of the offspring's stress response axis. And that in turn means that later on in life, they might have altered stress coping abilities, different behaviors to piglets that came from non-stressed mothers. For example, they might show higher levels of aggression. And we've also seen effects on their immunity levels. So they are less resistant to disease. So overall, their productivity is detrimentally affected by the mother being chronically stressed during pregnancy. So we obviously don't want that. We want to protect the piglets from that. So my work, and specifically the last study in my PhD, focused on trying to reduce the chronic stress levels in the mother to then influence the piglets. And so maybe if I describe this study, I will sort of put it into context. So basically we had two groups of sows, a control and a treatment. And in the treatment, we improved the gestational environment of the sows in terms of both psychological well-being and also physical well-being. So we added racks with straw for the sows as enrichment to stimulate their natural behaviors. We gave them some rope to chew on as well, and we put in rubber mats in the feeding stalls for more comfort while resting. And we did all of that to sort of improve the welfare of the sows overall. We had a number of measures taken as well to measure the welfare of the sows and the chronic stress levels of the sows. And then in comparison to that, the control group had just a standard conventional environment without any of the improvements. Same type of pen, just none of the improvements. And then we followed those sows up until the end of lactation, and we looked at how their piglets developed in terms of their health and resilience and welfare measures as well. So the main result coming from that, which we were really happy about, was that we saw lower levels of scour in the piglets that came from the improved sow group. So the sows that had higher welfare and lower chronic stress levels in pregnancy ended up producing piglets that were more resilient, better sort of resistant to disease, and they had lower scour levels. And I think that's a really important result in the whole context of antimicrobial resistance that we're all trying to sort of combat now at the moment. Having piglets that are more resistant to disease basically means they will be better able to cope with disease challenges later on in life, and that just means we'll have to use less antibiotics to treat them, which helps to prevent the antimicrobial resistance that we're trying to combat. So it also means lower costs for medication that the farmer needs to incur. So we were really happy about that result because it really did show that link between the sow stress levels and the piglet welfare and resilience in early life. But so in this study, we really focused on the early life, but from other studies, we know that these are long lasting effects. So it really is a long-term benefit to improve the environment and the well-being of the sows in gestation to reap those benefits in terms of the piglet productivity even later on.
Yeah, it's really good that you saw that, right? It just to show yet another benefit of providing this environment to the sows, right? It's not just about meeting code requirements or something like that. Like it will actually help in the
Yeah.
long run. And even with the piglets, which I think, we tend to separate once they're off the sow, it's like now they're a different problem. And so, and a lot of the ways that we've been trying to look at nursery performance and stuff like that has been more related to nutrition and other
Yeah,
aspects, and not even thinking like, well, what came first, right? And how that impacts. So that would
exactly.
be very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe for the last little bit of the episode today, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about what you're going to be focusing on in your postdoc now at WCVM. I think it's related to Carcass measurements, but I might be wrong.
You're right. Yes. No,
Okay.
you're correct.
Yeah. So we'll just let you maybe introduce that and what you'll be working on.
Yeah, so the project that I'm on now, I'm part of Dr. Yolande Seddon's swine welfare group here at the University of Saskatchewan. So it's really nice for me to switch to grower finisher pigs coming from, my PhD where I focused on sows and piglets. Now I can sort of get to know other stages of pig production much better. So that's very nice for me. But the project itself that I'm currently working on is part of the NSERC IRC in swine welfare, where Dr. Seddon is the chair of that. And the project basically is investigating the potential of carcass-based indicators to be able to use those indicators and tell us retrospectively something about the welfare that those pigs experienced both on farm and also in pre-slaughter handling. And we're focusing on the carcass-based indicators because it's a good way to improve welfare assessment in pigs. And this is because the sort of method that we currently have for assessing welfare in pigs, while these methods are very effective, they are only being performed on farm. And that comes with a lot of issues such as, the main thing being risk to biosecurity. They're also very time consuming. They can be expensive. And in Canada, as I understand it, they're only really performed once a year, and it's not always done by a third party as well. So they're done by people. So there's potential for human error and bias to come in as well. So switching that welfare assessment from the on-farm stage to the slaughter stage would really overcome a lot of those issues, and that's why we want to know whether we can use those carcass indicators to link back to the welfare that the animals experienced on farm. And then, so that's sort of the first part of the project. And the second part is to investigate the potential to automate this welfare assessment system using computer vision. So we are collaborating here at the university with a computer engineering team who are developing an algorithm, a computer vision system, which can detect the carcasses, the different sides of the carcass, so the side and the back of the carcass. So this part is actually complete. We are successfully able to detect those different sides of the carcass. And the next step in that is to teach the algorithm to actually pick out the specific lesions, so those carcass based indicators, to basically automate the system and to potentially scale it up to commercial levels. So if we are able to do that, the data can be easily collected at the slaughterhouse, and it can then easily be stored, looked at, and basically used as a way of providing feedback to the producers on the welfare levels that we see in their animals as they come to the slaughter stage. So I think it would really have it will have a really good effect on welfare, and just helping producers to improve their management practices by pinpointing the different issues that might be happening, but also showing them where what they are doing is going well. So it's a sort of, we can tell them the positives and maybe the areas that need a little bit more work to improve the welfare, and ultimately improve their own productivity of the farm as well, because welfare is always linked to better productivity and more sort of economic gain from the carcasses as they go to slaughter.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, feedback would be a very good thing for the producers to have, to see, if there appears to be a problem or whatever. And maybe this is a loaded question, but do you think that there might be something where if it's like you see these issues, then that then maybe spurs to a visit or something to kind of be like, what's going on? Let's see what's happening, or is it just more? Do you think along the lines of, here's some feedback you might want to improve, but we'll leave it at that?
I mean, I suppose we will have to see how the tool is implemented on farm and whether it is whether there is uptake of it. But I think it could, lead to visits, to sort of help the producers to work on the issues that they might be having, and just basically to help them address whatever problems are seen. To help them move towards both better welfare, but also better productivity for them.
Yep. Yeah, just another tool, the same thing we do with carcass
Yeah,
measures for quality, right? It's like, okay, well, you might want to adjust your nutrition or something like that as a result of what we're
exactly.
seeing. It's another
Yeah.
thing. And,
Mm.
realizing that, anything that improves the welfare and obviously reduces lesions or other issues is only going to be a benefit, right?
Mm.
So,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And and also at the national level, this tool could potentially be used in things like benchmarking and setting of standards. So ultimately, it could help really improve welfare of animals at national level, and also help the industry overall in Canada to improve its productivity. And that's the ultimate goal, because we are working with producers and we both want the same thing. So it would
yeah.
be nice to see uptake of this.
Yeah, no, very, very good point that, it's from a benchmarking perspective, but it is, as an industry, this is what we want, right? We want to take care of the animals and do the
Exactly.
best
Yeah.
that we can for them and move on that, like at a
Hmm.
national level, and maybe even, on the international as a kind of
Yeah,
get the information
for
out there,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think very good. So lots of information, great information, I think, and hopefully, the people that listen, get something out of the episode, out of something in there. But I guess if you wanted the listeners to get like one or two take home messages from today's episode, what would that be?
I suppose for as maybe a piece of advice, for students. So I still feel like I'm a student, really. I don't really, I only completed my PhD earlier this year. So I'm still in that mindset. But maybe a piece of advice for students is to don't be afraid to go for it and put yourself out there. For me, coming to Canada is an example of that. I really, really wanted to come here and to work in the pig industry here. And it took a bit of time, but I finally did it. So I think and that came as a result of me trying to push myself outside of my own box and out of my own comfort zone. So in terms of that, I would say students just sort of go for it and follow your dreams. And then another sort of take home message from my work, I suppose, would be to try and always think of the bigger picture, because like you said, going back to that sow and the piglet, we don't always link up the different stages, but everything is linked. So whatever we do with the sow will affect her offspring later on. So it's good to consider things as an overall and not just separate parts. I think it's always good to think of the bigger picture, and that really applies in many areas, not just the work that I've done or the pig industry. It applies everywhere, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think great messages.
It's time for our famous three. Working with nature and not against it, piglets fed AX3 see significant and improved feed efficiency. Producers know the reality of needing to reduce antibiotic and zinc use. AX3 Digest is a highly digestible novel protein that promotes improved in-barn performance, piglet health, and minimizes the need for zinc in the diet. For more information, visit www.protecta.com. That's www.protecta.com.
Okay, so before I let you go, we ask 3 questions of all our guests.
Perfect.
So our first one, hopefully you've thought about this. So our first one is, what would be your favorite or go-to swine-related resource or book?
Yeah, so that's a really nice question. And it brings me to this resource that is really new, because it's a website. It was launched only a few weeks ago. It's called PAW, and that stands for Positive Animal Welfare. So it's been collated by researchers from SRUC, so that's Scotland's Rural College. And while it's a resource for really all species, there is some really good information on pig welfare and specifically improving positive welfare in pigs. So currently in the area, we're really trying to not only minimize the negative welfare experiences that pigs have, but we're also trying to promote the positive welfare in pigs. So this website just has a lot of nice information, facts on positive welfare in pigs, but also has current research that's happening in the area, and links to different potential groups that are working on this. So yeah, there's just a lot of good information on positive pig welfare there, which is worth checking out.
Yeah, great. It's always good to have those resources and that information available instead of stuck behind a paywall in a journal.
Exactly.
So great. Hopefully people check that out. So the next question then is, thinking outside of pigs, what would be a favorite book or something that you would recommend people go out and get from the bookstore?
For me, really, any Stephen King novel is a good read, always. But in terms of a more science-related subject, I really liked Temple Grandin's and Katherine Johnson's Animals in Translation. I just think for animal welfare and behavior people, it's a great way to try and put yourself in the animal's shoes to really understand their behavior and how they're experiencing and perceiving the environment around them. So if you're trying to really get into that mindset of how is the animal thinking and understanding what they are doing and why they are doing it, this is a really great book. It's written in a nice, easy language, and there's a lot of little anecdotes in it that are really sort of interesting. So I would recommend that one.
Yeah. One of my biggest academic celebrity moments was meeting Temple Grandin for the first time and having her sign my copy of Animals in Translation. Great. So I have a signed
that would
copy,
be a
which
dream
is good.
For me too. That's
and I'm definitely a Stephen King fan too, so I would recommend that as well. So, okay. So our last question then is, when you think back at leaders or mentors that you've had, or if you think to swine producers that you've worked with, what is a characteristic that makes some of those more successful than others, or particularly good at what they do?
I think for any leader in any area, it's always good to be able to keep your head sort of in the game and clear when things happen, when problems pop up. And that always happens, when things fall apart. Keeping your cool is always a good way to be. And I think any leader should have that skill. And that kind of plays into resilience. So just like I said, we want the piglets to be resilient. We also want the leaders to be resilient, because if you're able to sort of recover from the bad experience, from any challenge that comes your way, that really defines that you're a good leader, I suppose, and you're able to keep going with it despite any sort of whatever happens. Just leave it in the past and move on.
Yeah. I've heard that also referred to as grit. If you have the grit, which is also a book recommendation. It's called Grit, and it's all about that ability. It's not the setback, it's how you respond to the setback, right?
Exactly.
And that is a very key feature in who's successful. Great point. Okay, that brings us to the end. So I will thank you again for agreeing to come on, and hopefully, you had a good experience. And again, the audience, I think will really enjoy this episode.
Thank you. Yeah, this was great for me as well. So thanks for having me again. And I really enjoyed chatting about this. So thank you.